Council, and we're being recorded. Our program today is a conversation with Ambassador Kenneth Juster, who was the U.S. Ambassador to India from until January of this year, and is now a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. I want to give a special welcome to Dr. Jagdish Sheth, our board member, Padma Award winner, and Kel Statt, Professor of Business at the Goizueta Business School at Emory, Joe Bankoff from the Sam Nunn School at Georgia Tech, also a board member. And I hope he's on, Nagesh Singh, the Chief of Protocol from the Indian Ministry of External Affairs. I want to also welcome Anita Nayan, who is the chair of the Indian American Chamber of Commerce of Georgia, Deva Huja from CFO of Novelis, Madhusan Menon from Infosys BPM here in Atlanta. And there's several reps of Blue Diamond Growers, the almond cooperative in California. So welcome to all of you. Our program today is sponsored by Novelis. Novelis is the leading producer of flat-rolled aluminum products and the world's largest recycler of aluminum. If I'm not mistaken, Novelis is the largest Indian company with its headquarters, its U.S. subsidiary headquartered in Atlanta. Steve Fisher is the CEO of Novelis, and I'm going to turn this over to you, Steve, to introduce our speaker.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador Shapiro, and good afternoon to everybody. It's a sincere honor to be here with you today to introduce Ambassador Juster and just to be part of this gathering of the World Affairs Council. On behalf of myself and Novelis, I truly hope you and your family and loved ones are all doing well as we continue to navigate our way through this pandemic. And while I'm encouraged, I'm sure we're all encouraged by the immense progress we've made, especially with the arrival and administration of the vaccines. We know that many countries, including India, are still in great need. And as Ambassador Shapiro said, at Novelis, we have a deep connection to India as a subsidiary of Hindalco Industries, a leader in the aluminum and copper industries, and one of the flagship companies of the Aditya Birla Group based in Mumbai. Our company's purpose is shaping a sustainable world together, and this truly connects our employees around the world. It guides our strategy decisions and allows us and continues to embed us in our communities and our commitment to our communities in a very purposeful way. So with purpose is top of mind, I am particularly delighted to introduce you to Ambassador Kenneth Juster. Ambassador Juster recently completed his service as the 25th U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of India. Prior to that role, he served in the U.S. government as Deputy Assistant to the President for International Economic Affairs on both the National Security Council and the National Economic Council, Undersecretary of Commerce, Acting Counselor of the State Department, and Deputy and Senior Advisor to Deputy Secretary of State Lawrence Engelberger. As Undersecretary of Commerce, he co-founded the U.S. India High Technology Cooperation Group and was a key architect of the Next Steps in Strategic Partnership initiative between the United States and India. In the private sector, Ambassador Juster has been a partner at the global investment firm Warburg Pincus, a senior executive at Salesforce.com, and a senior partner at the law firm Arnold and Porter. For his service as ambassador, he received the State Department's Distinguished Service Award, the Defense Department's Distinguished Public Service Award, the Director of National Intelligence Exceptional Service Award, and the Energy Department's Excellence Award. Ambassador Juster holds a law degree from Harvard Law School, a master's degree in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in government from Harvard College. Ambassador, It's an honor to have you with us today. We are profoundly appreciative of your service, and we look forward to hearing from you, hearing your thoughts and insights this afternoon. And with that, I will turn this over to you, Ambassador.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Steve, for that very kind introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here before the World Affairs Council in Atlanta. And I'm happy to turn it to Charles and follow your direction as to how you'd like to proceed.
That's great. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Ambassador Juster. To the audience, we're going to have questions from the audience. I'd ask you to submit them using the chat function. So at about 12:30, I'll start asking questions. Please make your questions short, and so it's easier for me. Ken, U.S. Indian relations really made enormous strides under your leadership as U.S. Ambassador to India. Can you give us, like, when you came back to Washington and you met with the National Security Advisor, what's the executive summary in a paragraph? What are your top accomplishments as ambassador?
Okay, well, thank you. It's a very complex relationship between the United States and India. It's really warmed up and been transformed over the last 20 years, and it's steadily expanded the range of issues that we deal with until now. We deal with, I think, every issue in human endeavor, from defense to non-proliferation, counterterrorism, trade, investment, energy, the environment, science and technology, agriculture, education, space, oceans, and so much more. So it's tough to limit the issues that we focused on in too precise a way, but let me focus on a few of the areas where we were very ambitious, and I think we achieved a lot. First, in the diplomatic sphere, the very notion of the Indo-Pacific region was something that we really developed and solidified during the last 4 years. It first originated by the Japanese years ago, but it lay in disuse. And we wanted to reunite the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean as a region. And we got the Indians on board with that. The Japanese were already, the Australians, the ASEAN countries, and that was a very significant concept. And then we relaunched the Quad, which was a grouping of India, United States, Japan, and Australia to deal with a range of issues in the Indo-Pacific region. In the defense sector, we established a 2+2 ministerial with the top defense and foreign policy leaders in both countries, and concluded what are known as enabling or foundational agreements between the two military establishments that really will allow us to operate in a cohesive and integrated way. We also increased our military exercises to have the first ever tri-services exercise that involved India's Army, Navy, and Air Force. We established for the first time liaison officers at our major military facilities. Very quickly in the economy, we continued to increase trade and investment levels in both countries. When I was first working on India as Undersecretary of Commerce, we had about $20 billion in bilateral trade. When I left, we had about $147 billion in bilateral trade. Energy, we expanded our exports from to include liquefied natural gas for the first time, crude oil for the first time, and also works in renewables. And then finally, I'd highlight in healthcare, we've always had a long relationship on HIV/AIDS, on tuberculosis, and trying to rid India of that disease, on working together in antimicrobial resistance. But with COVID-19, we even integrated our health assistance and operations even further and worked together, including on the development and production of vaccines.
That's a long list and a huge.
A long paragraph.
Oh, that's great. I mean, congratulations to you. What do you wish? I mean, if you'd had, what was on the verge of achieving when you left? What do you wish you had another 6 months to finish up on?
Well, I don't know if I would have been able to finish up on it, but I think the area that's disappointing because it doesn't fulfill its potential is the economic relationship. And while levels of trade and investment have continued to rise, in fact, my Minister Counselor for Commercial Affairs would always say it's never been better because it continues to grow, it falls far short of what the potential is for these two countries. And we had tried to have just a small trade package to open up some of India's markets, and we were unable to conclude that. We talk about trying to negotiate a free trade agreement, but that's way off in the future. But India's economy, unfortunately, has not opened as readily as we think is in their own interest to do. And in fact, in the last few years, it's been closing. So that's an area of frustration, and that's going to be a challenge for the Biden administration going forward.
You mentioned the quadrilateral security dialogue, the Quad as it's called for short, which is India, Australia, Japan, and the U.S. How do you see that evolving? Is it meant to evolve into a formal security relationship and an alliance like NATO?
No, I do not expect it to evolve as a security alliance or any type of alliance. You know, India believes in strategic autonomy and is not an ally. It's a strategic partner of the United States. And India resides in a very different geographical and historical position than the United States. It has China on its northern border, and it doesn't want to do anything to overly antagonize the Chinese. And so the notion of a military alliance or military grouping is really not something that the Indians would embrace. Instead, they want to have, as we do, these four countries, which are democracies in the region, to work together cooperatively on a range of issues to help build out the architecture of the Indo-Pacific region. And while maritime security is one issue that we'll focus on, more recently, they had a Quad summit and focused on vaccines and healthcare issues, on emerging technologies, cooperation on 5G, for example, or cybersecurity, and also on climate-related issues. We've also worked together on pandemic relief and humanitarian assistance. But this will be something that gradually evolves over time and even works flexibly with other countries in the region.
But that security relationship, you mentioned the tri-service exercising together. India's buying defense equipment from the United States, something which they had but they were not interested in for a very long time. And it looks like they're interested in buying more defense equipment from the United States. Is that an area that we should focus on?
Well, India, throughout the Cold War, while it was leader of the non-aligned movement, had leaned toward the Soviet Union, in part because we had leaned toward Pakistan, and it ended up buying most of its military equipment from the Soviet Union and has continued to make significant purchases from Russia. It has slowly diversified, and in the last 15 years, U.S. sales have gone from virtually zero to over $20 billion, and we significantly added about $3.5 billion during my time as ambassador. And so India is buying more American equipment, but it's buying equipment from a variety of countries, not just us, but as I said, Russia, also Israel and France. And this is one of the challenges that India will face, because you, in the defense area, are not just trying to accumulate equipment, you need to build systems and networks that can talk to each other. And it's tough to do if you have different equipment from different countries, including some of which are adversaries and won't talk to each other because they don't want that equipment to be integrated. So that's a challenge for India. We'd like to see more purchases of US equipment, but we're not there yet. It's a gradual process.
Well, you were ambassador, Prime Minister Narendra Modi made a state visit to the United States, and President Trump paid a reciprocal visit to India. Looking from the outside, watching the news, visits by heads of government, heads of state appear to be very formal, very restricted by protocol. Do they really move the policy agenda forward? And in this case, did this move the U.S. India policy agenda forward?
I actually think during my time, these were very significant visits, and perhaps unique among state visits in the following sense. There's a strong people-to-people relationship in U.S. India partnership overall. There are 4 million Indian Americans in the United States. And when Prime Minister Modi came to the United States in September of 2019, he held a gathering in Houston to which he invited President Trump with over 50,000 people in the stadium there. And when President Trump came back to India, and this was in February of 2020, Prime Minister Modi hosted him in Ahmedabad at a stadium with over 100,000 people.
Wow.
That's unheard of in terms of foreign leaders. And so it really continued to strengthen the foundation of the relationship, but also these visits serve as action-forcing events. And when the Prime Minister came to the United States in 2019, we held the first quadrilateral ministerial meeting. As I said, we had relaunched this at the working level, but that was the first ministerial among the ministers of the 4 countries of the Quad. And when President Trump came to India in 2020, that's when we concluded about $3 billion of defense sales. So that was also significant beyond the other range of issues that we discussed and made progress on.
Novellus is a perfect example of Indian investment in the United States, an Indian company here. How do we encourage more? How do we get more U.S. companies to invest in India and more Indian companies to invest in the United States? What's the role of government in those decisions as opposed to private sector in both countries seeing opportunities and taking advantage of it?
Yeah, well, ultimately, obviously, private companies have to crunch the numbers and make a decision whether they want to invest or not. We've seen increasing levels of Indian investment in the United States. The U.S. is, I think, especially after the recent lowering of corporate taxes and simplifying of regulations, is the most hospitable major economy in the world to foreign investment, and Indian investment in this country has been increasing, as has U.S. and India. As I said, it's just not at the level it should be, but there were close to 2,000 U.S. companies that operate in India. India began to liberalize and open its economy in 1991, and while it was going at a pace that I think was less than optimal for its own benefit, it was still gradually opening until about 2018, where it's now started to gradually close and raise tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade. It still has as well a less than predictable regulatory regime. And so it's not always regarded as the easiest place to do business. And there are challenges for US companies that go to India. There are also challenges of infrastructure and labor law issues. And then companies have to make a decision of what's the long-term projection for India and how willing they are to deal with some of the short-term obstacles and difficulties of operating there.
How do you explain that? You have this trend where it's getting easier to do business in India, and then it starts to reverse. And what's the analysis? That's domestic Indian politics?
Yeah, I think there is to a certain degree. I think there is a desire in India to build up national champions. They've seen that successfully done in China. Coming out of COVID, there's a desire to reduce dependencies in other countries. There's a notion of self-reliant India, and India says it wants to still remain engaged globally, but they'd rather do that by getting investment from overseas and then exporting than having a two-way flow of trade back and forth. History shows in the region of Asia, we saw it in East Asia, and even in India itself, when countries open up, they grow the fastest. So my concern is that by not opening either as rapidly as they could or indeed closing a bit, they're going to hurt their own growth. These are not concessions they should be making in the United States, but measures they should be taking in their own self-interest. But this is one of the question marks that will remain in the years ahead, is how India manages economy, especially coming out of the severe contractions caused by the COVID pandemic.
Were you surprised by that huge COVID wave? I mean, it was almost a wall that hit India so hard in March and April.
Well, it was surprising how extensive it was. It was not surprising that there was a second wave. And India has some unique challenges in dealing with COVID. Initially, it had perhaps the most severe lockdown of any major economy, maybe perhaps after China's, in March of last year, in part because their healthcare system did not have adequate beds and medical supplies, protective equipment, oxygen tanks, ventilators. And it used the month or two of that lockdown to build up that supply capacity so that when business started to open up again, and it really has to in India because the lockdown and people on subsistence wages has tremendous collateral damage itself. But as it began to open up, it had the capacity in the medical area to deal with the COVID cases. It had an initial spike, as most countries did, but the levels were coming down significantly by the time I left in January. In fact, I was able to travel around India the last quarter of 2020 without a problem. I went to various states outside of the Delhi region. And unfortunately, I think India became a little overconfident about whether it had actually conquered the COVID pandemic. And they had elections in 4 states and 1 union territory with numerous rallies of people, hundreds of these, or over 100 of them, without masks, close together. And they even moved up a Hindu festivity pilgrimage called Kumbh Mela from 2022 to 2021. And you had over 1 million people coming from all over the country converging on the city of Haridwar. And therefore, they had this huge second wave. And in their defense, they had the mutated variant of the Delta variant of the virus, which turned out to be highly contagious, including to younger people. And it has a significant younger population, 65% of people under the age of 35. So all of these factors converge to have a very severe second wave that has now seemed to have peaked out, and levels are down very low again in terms of reported cases of COVID. And I know that they're preparing their healthcare facilities for a potential third wave.
Wow. Let's get into the advice part of the discussion here. I mean, you returned during the transition of administrations. I'm going to guess you've not met with President Biden. If you could give him a piece of advice, or the people running India policy at the National Security Council, what advice would you give them?
Well, it's an interesting question, because India is not a place that there's a crisis in the U.S. relationship. So often when policymakers wake up in the morning, they're not thinking about it at the top of their mind, because they may be worrying about China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. But it's a tremendously significant country. I think the Indo-Pacific region, which I talked about earlier, is becoming the center of gravity of international affairs. We have the countries with the largest populations, the largest economies. There's a tremendous amount of international trade that goes through the waters. There's huge natural resources. And a strong India and a strong U.S.-India relationship is a key pillar for stability and prosperity in that region. So although India is not necessarily on the top of policymakers' minds when they wake up in the morning because a crisis is not occurring, I think it's very important that the president and his team focus significant attention on the U.S.-India relationship, which, by the way, they have seemed to do thus far, including the president having a summit meeting of Quad leaders, which I was pleased to see was a continuation of our emphasis on the Quad. So
what advice would you give Prime Minister Modi if he were to call you up right now and say, you know, Ambassador Juster, I need help with this new U.S. administration? What's your advice for him?
Well, I wouldn't focus as much on the administration. What I say is that India, as I mentioned earlier, is not aligned with any country. It believes in strategic autonomy, and it views the world as a multipolar place where India can have leverage because of its ability to have good relations with the countries around it and throughout the world. I think, though, the world is moving in a direction that may not be as favorable to India's perspective in the following sense. You have China on its northern border with nuclear weapons. You have Pakistan on its western border with nuclear weapons, in a very dangerous region. And while it wants to maintain its freedom of action, I think it's going to have to, over time, have closer relationships with a few trusted partners rather than good relations with a lot of partners. So I think it's going to have to start focusing on some key partnerships. I think the U.S.-India partnership is number one among those. And they've got to look at that as a two-way partnership where India is providing the United States certain things that it feels are important in the partnership, as well as receiving benefits from the U.S.
What would you advise your successor? I mean, there's no ambassador in New Delhi now, no U.S. ambassador. We've got a chargé running business, but a chargé, we all know, can't do what an ambassador can do. Eric Garcetti has not been, I don't think he's been officially nominated, but his name has been, I think the president intends to nominate Los Angeles Mayor Garcetti as ambassador to India. What's your advice to him? What should he know to be able to understand India and to build on the legacy that you're handing over to him?
Well, let me speak about it generically for the new ambassador, because there has been no nomination, and I don't know what the president intends to do or not. But India is it's a complex and complicated country. It's really, in some respects, many countries rolled up into one. There's tremendous diversity if you go to the Northeast or the Himalayas or down south to Kerala or throughout the Hindu belt in the middle of the country. And you really need to get outside of Delhi to understand the country well and visit the different regions, get to know the local politicians, and be able to provide Washington with a fuller picture of what's going on in this very complex and fascinating and compelling place. And then I'd say at the same time, it's a very large mission. It's the third largest US mission in the world with 2,500 employees spread out over 4 consulates and the embassy in Delhi. And you've got to get to know your people from 30 plus different government agencies and offices and set priorities that make them work together as an integrated team. So it's both getting outside of Delhi and getting your own team working together in the same directions. I think 2 significant things.
Setting policy aside, what was the thing that you are proudest of that you were able to do while you were in India?
I'd say that, there's a lot of controversy about the foreign policy of the previous administration, and there's been criticism that they pulled out of international agreements and have had a tough relationship with allies. But what I'm most proud is that the U.S. India relationship, I think, was a very strong success. The United States was very popular in India. And if you look at the last 20 years of U.S. India relations, there's been steady progress made from administration to administration across political parties. And I believe that that's continued to be the case. I think we handed off at a very solid handoff in terms of the relationship. And the new administration has picked up on the Indo-Pacific. They had not previously endorsed that concept. They refer to it as the Asian Pacific. They have an Indo-Pacific coordinator at the National Security Council. They've continued the Quad, and they've elevated it to a summit meeting. They've continued the 2+2 dialogue. And therefore, the fact that that relationship has continued to be strong and has been positive and there's been continuity, I'd say, is the thing I'm most proud of. I guess I would add as an aside, perhaps in a more lighthearted way, is that I was very big on sports diplomacy when I was in India, from cricket to badminton, field hockey, football, or what we call soccer. And we also hosted the National Basketball Association for its first games in India, exhibition games. And I did a videotape welcoming them with some basketball shots that actually was picked up and featured on ESPN on the Jump Show. So people can see that online. But that was also a highlight, personally.
Did you sink the basket?
There were multiple basketball shots. You need to Google it, Charles, and you can decide for yourself.
Okay, that's very cool. Okay, we're gonna take some questions from the audience now. Not necessarily in order. Please keep sending them in via chat, and please make them short. Let me see. It just keeps jumping around. I saw one from Jag Sheth, which I think was the first one, actually, if I can find it again. Well, I'll get to it in a minute. It says, India has a population of 1.4 billion people. China has slightly larger India, but China was able to do a better job at lifting people out of poverty more quickly. Why is that, and what can India learn from that?
Well, that may be a short question, but it's not a short answer. These two countries were in a similar position, in 1980, and they're now at a place where the Chinese economy is 5 times larger than the Indian economy, and there has been a much greater transformation there. Part of it is India is, as I said, a very diverse democratic country, and it doesn't operate with the same authoritarian direction that the Chinese do. But I also think a significant part was the Chinese opened their economy. They welcomed in trade investment companies, and that really significantly aided their growth. They've now since changed their reforms and have become a much more difficult place to do business. But during their high growth era, they really had a lot of trade going on, a lot of investment, and a lot of migration of people in and out. And so I think that played a significant role in really creating a huge differential with India.
Kwon-Suk Lee, who is the Deputy Consul General of the Republic of Korea in the southeastern United States, asks about the border disputes between China and India. What is the desired end state, and how do those two countries get there?
Well, this is a very challenging issue and a very serious one. As I mentioned earlier, China and India are both nuclear countries. Now, no one wants to have a military conflict, but the issues become very tense. So the Chinese and the Indians fought a war in 1962 related to territory that China still claims in the east, the state that India calls Arunachal Pradesh is Chinese territory, and they've always claimed certain territories throughout a 2,000-mile border. And they've, over the years, been able to reach some protocols on how to manage it. They do not have a clearly demarcated boundary in much of this area, and there's disputed territory, but they've been able to manage the patrols and how they deal with the issue. But for the first time, really, well, they had a dispute in 2007. They've had disputes, the little ones over the years. They had a standoff where China, India, and Bhutan meet in the Doklam area for 73 days, but we're able to resolve that. They put in place some informal summits between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi to try to manage issues. And the Indians and the Chinese have pretty much compartmentalized the border issue as they continue to their host of other relationship matters. But then in 2020, the Chinese were doing some training exercises in the Tibetan region of China, and then turned suddenly and amassed 50,000 troops and heavy artillery and like on the Indian border, and in fact moved into some of this contested territory. And that situation has not fundamentally changed. There's been some disengagement around a strategic lake in that region, but there are still significant, I think maybe up to 50,000 troops on either side, and the Indians had to mobilize. We're talking about territory that's 15, 16,000 feet high in the Himalayas, and awful winters and very, very difficult. This has shattered the trust that India has with China. It's changed the relationship. For the first time in 45 years, there were actually casualties along the border. 20 Indians were killed in a fight with the Chinese, and an unknown number of Chinese were killed. So I think that it's not clear what the end state is, and neither side wants to back down, and both sides want to say that they prevailed. And so the question that they've been wrestling with is, how do you disengage and de-escalate, but also say we prevailed? And the Indians now have to even worry, is there going to be a two-front conflict with the Pakistanis on the west because of their close relationship with China? So they've gone out of their way, I think, to try to ease the relationship with Pakistan, and they negotiated in February of this year a sort of following of the ceasefire protocols with Pakistan on the line of control between those countries. So this is a very tense situation, and one that requires continued vigilance and attention.
Is there a role for the international community in this, or is this simply a bilateral issue?
Well, I think the international community can urge both sides to try to resolve it, but the Indians have a long history, and I think the Chinese wanting to resolve issues directly themselves and not have a third party mediate or resolve it. I think they've had perhaps some third party assistance in creating meetings between the two. But this ultimately will have to be something that the Indians and the Chinese figure out and how to move forward on. But it has fundamentally changed the relationship, in my view. And it's actually, the Chinese have never stated what their motivation was. They had built throughout the last 20 years increased infrastructure on their side of this line of actual control. And only more recently had the Indians increase their infrastructure, and the Chinese may have felt that it was getting too close, even though that India feels that that was their prerogative and they were just responding to what the Chinese had been doing. Some feel that China was trying to send India a message: don't get too close to the United States, don't increase this Quad activity and other aspects of the strategic partnership. If that was the Chinese motivation, it's worked in just the opposite direction, because it's actually further accelerated the development of the Quad and energized the relationship.
Well, I found Jag's question to you. Jag Sheth asks, India needs to modernize its agriculture sector. And the U.S. is very advanced in agriculture. How can the U.S. and India collaborate to modernize India's farming? And noting here that that's really been a difficult issue in domestic Indian politics, no?
Well, there are several dimensions to that question, but let me say that one of the fundamental areas of the U.S.-India cooperation from early in the relationship has been in the area of agriculture. And the U.S. was really, through its assistance, helped with the Green Revolution in India, and continues to provide agricultural assistance. I had an office in my embassy of people from the Department of Agriculture, and that's something we focus on. Separately, the challenge that India has is that farmers, still make up maybe 50% of the population, and yet only contribute to about 14 or 15% of the GDP. And you have a lot of farms now that are small plots of land because they've been divided over the years among families without having major agricultural conglomerates. And India is trying to reform its agricultural sector to make it more efficient. And that was where China made its big transformation, was moving people from agriculture into the cities. Again, they could do it in a command structure that the Indians don't have, but grappling with this fact that you have a lot of political power with farmers, but it doesn't contribute as much to the economy, is a struggle. And even as the government has tried to put forward meaningful reforms, for one reason or another, it's upset existing interest in the agricultural sector and led to lots of protests, and they've been very difficult. The government has had to pull back on a number of the reforms they proposed, which are, from outside economists, widely viewed as good policy measures, but they're politically have been unable to be implemented.
I know we went through a lot of the same issues in the late 19th and early 20th century in the United States as we transformed from a primarily agricultural nation to an industrial nation. These are not unheard of.
Yeah. And as you know, the agricultural sector is one of the most politically sensitive and difficult ones to deal with, which also affects international trade issues as well. That's a whole nother story, but dealing with agriculture in the trade area is very sensitive.
Annie Agniotri asks about the impact of the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. It leaves a vacuum there.
Yeah.
Afghanistan doesn't border India, but is really, really close. How do you see that affecting?
It's an hour and a half flight, I think, from Delhi to Kabul, so it is very close, and it's going to have a big impact. India had been playing a sort of a low-key role relating to Afghanistan. It provided about $3 billion of humanitarian assistance over the last 18, 19 years. It rebuilt the parliament, provided training to Afghans and education in India, but it had decidedly not taken a military role, in part not to get in a difficult or exacerbate relations with Pakistan. And the Indians recognized that the United States could not continue to spend the degree of treasure and blood that it had in Afghanistan, but were very welcoming of the role that the U.S. had played. And now that the United States is leaving, there will be a big vacuum, and the Indians have had to, I think they're concerned that there might be increasing terrorism and instability coming from Afghanistan over to India, that Afghanistan and Pakistan may operate together against India. And so they've begun, and as I said earlier, to try to improve the relationship with Pakistan. They've reached out for the first time to Taliban, which was a group that they had not had contact or relations with. The Indians would like to see the gains that have been made in Afghanistan not be lost, and that the process should be led and controlled by and owned by the Afghans, and to ensure that the Taliban don't hijack that from the broader Afghan population. But they've also now reached out intensively to Turkey, to Iran, and to other countries in the region, Russia, China, to discuss how to deal with Afghanistan. But it's a newer concern. It's always been a concern, but it's an increased concern, and they're going to have to increase their diplomatic and other activity related to Afghanistan.
We've only got a few minutes left. There are a couple of questions I want to combine on environmental issues. I mean, and it essentially comes down to how does India, how do other developing countries, but how does India in particular balance reducing carbon emissions versus accelerating GDP growth?
Yeah, look, that's a big challenge. And I mean, India, unfortunately, has among the most polluted cities in the world in terms of its air quality and even the water quality. When I was ambassador, I wrote an op-ed on our own experience with air pollution in Los Angeles and other cities in the United States and how we were able to overcome that. And I think it's a huge challenge for the country because polluted air affects people's health, their productivity, the image of the country overall. But they've had difficulty in doing as much in that area as I think people would like to see. And that then feeds into the broader question of how do you deal with industrial growth and yet try to be environmentally sensitive. The Indians are making a big push in the renewable area for solar technology, for other wind technology. They also need resources, and part of their perspective on climate change is that, yes, they want to be a strong participant in it, but that there is a fund that was established in the United Nations that I think countries pledged $100 billion to, and they'd like to see that fully funded and to get their share of that money to help them in this transformation.
The other group of questions has to do with human rights. I'll note you're the former chair of Freedom House. How concerned should the international community be about the status of human rights and protection of human rights and minority rights in India?
Well, yeah, this is another issue. As I said, it's a very diverse country. There are people that have cultural traditions that may be different than ours. And the State Department puts out an annual human rights report, a religious freedom report, a human trafficking report. And India has a big role in all of those reports, and it's not always in a favorable way. And these are issues that we discuss privately with the Indians. And there are concerns as well that have come up that the current government, the BJP, is known as it's more of a Hindu nationalist party, and will that exacerbate sectarian issues and the divisions between Hindus and Muslims? And so all of these issues are part of the relationship and part of the dialogue between the countries, and challenge for the Biden administration in terms of how to address. They're not going to go away overnight, and we can't dictate to India how to conduct itself, but we can try to present our views and have a dialogue on them. And I should add that we're not perfect in this country either, and we don't want to hold ourselves out as being a lecturer to the rest of the world. We have our own challenges, and we're open to hearing from other countries about their perspective on things that we can do better as well.
That's a great answer. Right? We are indeed far from perfect, and we do love to lecture other countries. So we've got our own challenges. We're going to close the program now. I want to thank you, Ambassador Kenneth Juster, for devoting 45 minutes to us. In a couple of minutes, we're going to take a break and then go to a session for World Affairs Council members, a short off-the-record session. So I have two requests for audience members. Number one is join the World Affairs Council, either as an individual or as a corporate member. You don't have to live in Atlanta to watch these virtual programs. You don't need to live in Atlanta to support us. And secondly, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. The word is subscribe, but there's no charge for this subscription. You'll be notified when we upload this recording today and our other recordings. So please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We've got some upcoming programs in July I want to tell you about that we have just been able to nail down. On July 15th at noon, we're going to talk about Israel post Netanyahu with Tal Schneider, political correspondent of the Times of Israel. And then on July 27th at noon, we'll have Kristen Hillman, the Ambassador of Canada to the United States. The title of the program is Canada and the United States, Friends, Partners, and Allies. I I want to thank Matt Bianco from Novellis, who helped us work on the logistics for this program today. Valerie Lopez DeFrank, our producer, Laura Brower, our social media specialist, and Rennie, the council's interim program director, and our intern, Josephine Steenbergen, whose last day is tomorrow. I want to thank you, Josephine, for all your help this summer. You have been terrific. So now we're going to take a short break while we shift to an off-the-record session with Ambassador Juster for members of the World Affairs Council. And I think we all get moved into a breakout room. So everybody be patient. Thank you all for joining us, those of you who are leaving now.
Thank you.